Have you ever seen someone laugh while walking away from the very people who once called him family? This is the heartbreaking story of a man who thought he had it all, until the day life made him taste the cold he once forced upon others. You're watching Stories of Hope, where real stories remind us that sometimes the tables do turn in the most unexpected ways. Stick around, because this story, it just might change how you see love, loss, and the strength of a mother's heart. Before we begin, let us know, where in the world are you watching from? It was a bitter January morning when David slammed the door shut behind him, the sound echoing down the silent street. His wife, Caroline, stood frozen on the front porch, holding their 3-year-old daughter, Ella, in one arm and clutching the hand of 6-year-old Michael with the other. No shoes on the boy's feet, a torn sweater barely hanging on his tiny shoulders. Snow fell quietly around them, but David, he laughed. He actually laughed, like this was some kind of joke, like turning his back on them meant nothing. David had always been a charming man on the surface, tall, handsome, worked as a mid-level manager at a tech company. But behind closed doors, he was cold, selfish, and worse, cruel when things didn't go his way. Caroline had been with him for over a decade. She gave up her career as a nurse to raise their children. He promised her the world, but slowly that promise dissolved into resentment. Whenever money was tight, he blamed her. When the kids got sick or cried at night, he scowled and slammed doors. Love had long left their home. Caroline had seen the signs, of course, the late nights, the phone he never let her see, the way he avoided eye contact during dinner, but she didn't expect him to throw them out like garbage. Not like that, not in the middle of winter. That morning, the fight had started over something small, a bill Caroline had asked about, a medical expense for Ella's fever the previous week. David snapped. He said he was tired of being questioned, tired of carrying dead weight. He accused her of draining him, said the kids were just a burden, and then he opened the door and told her to leave. Just like that, no suitcase, no car keys, no dignity. Caroline didn't scream, she didn't beg. She just picked up Ella, held Michael close, and walked out into the freezing cold. The crunch of snow under their feet, the only sound for miles. She stood there for a moment hoping, just hoping, he'd realize what he was doing. But all she heard was the click of the lock behind her, and then silence. With nowhere to go, Caroline did the only thing she could. She walked and walked. For nearly 2 miles, she trudged through the snow with her children, their noses red, hands nearly numb. Finally, she reached a small community church with its lights still on. Pastor John opened the door, took one look at her trembling frame and the children's pale faces, and without a single question, welcomed them inside. That night, Caroline slept on a cot in the church basement, her arms wrapped tightly around both kids. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't heartbroken, she was, but because she had to be strong. For them, for Michael, who kept asking why Daddy locked them out, for Ella, who whimpered in her sleep. Caroline didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not going back. The next few weeks were the hardest of her life. The church arranged for temporary housing with a kind widow named Miss Margaret, who had a small spare room and a heart of gold. Caroline began working nights at a local diner, scraping together every dollar she could. Michael was enrolled in a nearby public school, and little Ella stayed with Miss Margaret during the day. It wasn't easy, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, there was no yelling, no walking on eggshells, just peace, even if it was quiet and fragile. Back at their old house, David didn't feel regret, not at first. He relished the quiet. No kids to trip over, no nagging, just him and his freedom. He met up with Vanessa, a woman from work he'd been seeing behind Caroline's back. She moved in within a month. She was younger, spontaneous, and didn't ask him about bills or his drinking. For a while it felt like he'd won, but time has a way of revealing the truth. Vanessa wasn't interested in building a life, just in spending money. She maxed out his credit cards within 6 months, and when David lost his job during company downsizing, she left him, taking everything she could grab on her way out. The house soon went into foreclosure. Friends stopped calling, and with no job, no savings, and no one left to turn to, David found himself sitting on the same porch he'd once thrown his family from, only this time, he was alone. Meanwhile, Caroline had slowly built something new. She saved enough to rent a small apartment. It was nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, cracked walls, but it was theirs. Michael grew stronger each day, and Caroline returned to nursing school part-time. Ella laughed again. She even started calling the bus driver her hero because he always gave her a lollipop. Still, Caroline never spoke David's name. Not in anger, not in pain. He was simply gone. She told the kids that sometimes people get lost in themselves, and that it's not their fault. Michael asked once if Daddy would ever come back. Caroline just kissed his forehead and said, "Some doors, once closed, stay that way." But fate had its own story to tell. Months later, on a rainy evening just like the one when he had once turned them away, David found himself standing at the very doorstep of Caroline's new apartment, soaked, ragged, hungry. His hands trembled as he knocked, and inside, Caroline heard the knock. She wasn't expecting anyone. She took a breath and slowly walked to the door. Caroline stood still, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her breath caught in her chest. The knock had come again, soft, hesitant but persistent. On the other side of that door could be a neighbor, a delivery, or a ghost from the past. Something deep in her gut told her it wasn't just another knock. Michael, now 7, peeked from the hallway. "Mum? Who is it?" She glanced at him, smiled gently. "Stay back, sweetheart." He nodded, sensing her unease, and stepped away. Slowly, she turned the knob and opened the door. There he was, David. His once pristine hair was overgrown, wet, and matted against his forehead. His coat was too big, as if borrowed or salvaged from a shelter bin. His cheeks were sunken, and there were dark circles under his eyes. And in his expression, there was no arrogance left, no smirk, only the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything. "Caroline," he muttered, barely above a whisper, "please." For a moment she couldn't speak, not because she was angry, but because she wasn't, not anymore. She was past that. What stood before her wasn't the man who had thrown her and their children into the snow. This was someone else, a broken shell of him. I need help," he continued. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Caroline didn't move. She didn't slam the door, but she didn't step aside either. "You laughed," she said quietly. "Do you remember that? You laughed when you shut the door on us." David looked down, ashamed. "I was wrong," he said. "I was so wrong." There was a pause so heavy you could hear the rain tapping on the porch roof. "I'm not here to beg you to take me back," he added. I'm hungry. I need somewhere to sleep, just for tonight." I swear she looked at him long and hard, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from surviving heartbreak. "There's a shelter 2 blocks from here, corner of Grant and 5th. Tell them you know Pastor John. He'll help." He blinked, stunned by her composure. "That's it? That's all you can do?" Caroline's voice was steady. "You made your choices, David. Now I'm making mine. I won't let you back into this home, not because I hate you, but because I love our children enough to protect their peace." He didn't argue, he couldn't. She handed him a small grocery bag with some sandwiches and an old hoodie. Then she closed the door, not slammed, not shoved, just closed, gently. Inside, Michael had returned to the living room with his math book. Ella was playing with her toy bear, giggling. Life went on. Caroline leaned against the door for a moment, then wiped away a single tear. Not because she still loved David, but because she finally realized she had the strength to let go. But David's story didn't end there. The next morning, Caroline walked Ella to school. As they rounded the corner, she noticed something across the street. A man hunched behind a bus stop bench, his body wrapped in a sleeping bag, barely moving. She looked closer. It was him, David. She didn't cross the street. She didn't speak. But something about the sight stuck with her all day. At work, while folding napkins between orders at the diner, her co-worker Lisa asked, "You okay? You look a little far off." Caroline nodded, but she wasn't sure. That night, she told Pastor John what had happened. "He's not the same man anymore," she said, "but I don't know if I feel sorry for him or just relieved." Pastor John, who had seen many stories like hers, smiled gently. "Sometimes, the people who break us come back for shelter, but that doesn't mean we have to bring them inside. Compassion doesn't mean forgetting. It means setting boundaries, with grace." Meanwhile, David spent the next week drifting from benches to church halls, trying to piece together what went wrong. He thought of the home he once owned, the kids he barely knew, and the woman who once looked at him like he was her whole world. It hit him harder each day, how much he had taken for granted. One night, he walked past Caroline's building. He didn't knock this time. He just stood across the street, staring up at the window with the light still on. Inside, Michael was doing homework, and Caroline was braiding Ella's hair. They were laughing. He smiled faintly. It was the first time in a long time he had smiled without bitterness. Then he turned away and kept walking. 3 months later, Caroline's life took a positive turn. Her boss at the diner noticed her hard work and offered her a manager-in-training position. With that came a better income and more stable hours. She re-enrolled in her nursing program full-time and arranged childcare with Miss Margaret, who had become like family. The kids were thriving. Michael's teacher even said he was the most polite boy in class. One evening, Caroline was preparing dinner when there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't David. It was a man in a clean shirt, carrying a brown envelope. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm from the downtown clinic. I believe you knew a man named David Connors." Her heart skipped. "He passed away last night. Exposure. We found this in his pocket. It's addressed to you." Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. After he left, she sat at the table, staring at it for what felt like hours. Inside was a short letter, handwritten. No dramatic apologies, no pleas, just a few simple words. "I see now what I destroyed. You built something better. I hope someday my children will know I was sorry. I'm proud of what you've become. David." Caroline didn't cry. She just folded the letter, placed it in a small box where she kept other pieces of her journey. Michael's first drawing, Ella's hospital bracelet, the apartment lease. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was peace. It had been nearly a year since David passed away. Caroline stood at the kitchen counter, stirring spaghetti sauce as the soft hum of the radio played in the background. The evening sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow across the tidy little apartment. It was quiet, peaceful, a peace Caroline had never known before, not even in the early days of her marriage. Michael, now 8, sat at the table, working on a school project, cutting out pieces of construction paper for his solar system model. Ella, 5, was humming as she colored at his side. Life had a rhythm now, a kind of gentle predictability that Caroline had once prayed for in the chaos of her old life. There were no more slammed doors, no fear of angry footsteps down the hallway, just laughter, homework, and the simple joy of tucking her kids into bed at night. Still, sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and the house was still, Caroline would think of David. Not with longing, not with hatred either, just a strange kind of heaviness. Regret, perhaps, not for her choices, but for the person he could have been if he had just seen what he had before it slipped through his fingers. One rainy afternoon, as Caroline was walking home from the diner, she passed by the church again, the same one where she had first spoken to Pastor John about David's return. A flyer pinned to the door caught her eye. It read, "New Life Group for those healing from grief, trauma, and broken families. All welcome." Caroline stared at it for a long moment, then tore off the bottom tab with the phone number and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night, after the kids were asleep, she sat by the window, dialing the number slowly. Her hands trembled, not out of fear, but something deeper, vulnerability. A woman answered. Her name was Sandra. Her voice was kind, without judgment. They talked for nearly 30 minutes. Caroline shared parts of her story, not all at once, just the beginning. Sandra listened, not with pity, but with understanding. A week later, Caroline sat in a circle with 5 other women in the church basement. Each one had their own version of heartbreak: a lost partner, an abusive parent, a broken home. For the first time, Caroline didn't feel like she had to be the strong one. She could just be, just feel. As the months passed, Caroline grew stronger, not just in the way she carried herself, but in how she believed in herself. Her nursing classes were going well. Her boss had become a mentor, even helping her with budgeting and saving for a car. She started writing a journal, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. And Michael began to ask more questions. "Mom," he said one night, "what happened to Dad?" Caroline had always known this question would come. She took a deep breath and pulled him close. "Your dad wasn't always kind. He made some very bad choices, but he also gave me 2 of the best gifts in my life, you and your sister." Michael nodded slowly. "Did he love us?" She paused, her eyes misting over. "I believe in his own broken way he did, but he didn't know how to show it." "Is that why he left us in the cold?" Caroline looked him in the eye. "Yes, and that was wrong. It hurt. But we're safe now. We're stronger because of it." Michael leaned into her. "I don't remember him much. Just your hugs." She smiled. "Then that's what matters." But not all memories could be erased, and not all wounds were visible. One evening, Caroline received a call from Pastor John. "There's something I think you should see," he said gently. He invited her to the church. When she arrived, he led her to the back room, where they stored lost belongings and donations. On the table was a small cardboard box, worn around the edges. This was left behind when the shelter cleared out old belongings. David had stored it here. Caroline hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were a few of David's personal items: a frayed wallet with a photo of Michael and Ella, one she had taken long ago during a picnic, a small notebook filled with scribbled thoughts, and a folded paper, a letter. Her hands shook as she opened it. "If you're reading this, Caroline, I hope it's not out of duty, but curiosity. I was never brave enough to admit I was wrong when it mattered. I failed you. I failed our kids. I thought strength was power, control, but it was really in you all along. You survived what I couldn't. I'm sorry. I'll never stop being sorry." Caroline didn't cry, not immediately. She just sat there, the letter in her lap, her heart full of a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She asked Pastor John if she could keep the photo. He nodded. That night, she placed it in a new frame, not to honor David, but to remind her children, when they were older, that healing didn't mean forgetting, and forgiveness didn't mean return. It meant letting go of the pain, and choosing peace. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Caroline received a letter in the mail from a lawyer. Inside was a notice that David had left behind a small life insurance policy. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover a few months' rent, but it came with a note from the lawyer. He left it in your name, for the children. Caroline sat on the couch, staring at the check. It wasn't the money that moved her, it was the gesture. Too little, too late, but still something. Maybe David had changed in those last months. Maybe not, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Caroline had taken the broken pieces and built a new life, a real life. Her kids were safe, her heart was steady, and her story wasn't one of tragedy. It was one of hope. Winter had returned. The wind howled outside Caroline's apartment, but inside it was warm, filled with the smell of cocoa, the soft buzz of the heater, and the gentle laughter of children. The same streets that once held the darkest night of her life now bore witness to something new, something whole. It had been nearly 3 years since David had thrown her and the kids out into the cold. 3 years since that heavy door had shut with laughter on the other side and nothing but bitter wind in her face. Caroline had worked hard, quietly, persistently. Her nursing classes had turned into a real job. She now worked nights at a care center and spent her days with the kids. They had moved into a slightly bigger apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. Safe, clean, peaceful. Michael was 10 now, thoughtful and sharp. He had his mother's kindness, but also a quiet strength that had been forged through those early, difficult years. Ella, bright and curious, had just turned 7. She still asked about her father sometimes, but less now. The questions had softened. The ache had dulled. Then one evening, just as the first snow began to fall, there was a knock at the door. It was late. Caroline had just finished tucking the kids into bed. She moved cautiously to the peephole, her heart suddenly uneasy. She looked and froze. It was David, or rather, what was left of him. He was thinner, his beard overgrown and streaked with grey. His eyes, once full of control and arrogance, were hollow now, tired and wet with desperation. His jacket was torn, his boots worn thin. He didn't look like the man who had laughed as he shut the door on her years ago. Caroline stood behind the door for a long moment, her breath caught between past and present. Then she opened it, just a crack. David looked up. "Caroline," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, I didn't know where else to go." She said nothing at first. Her heart beat hard in her chest, not with fear, not anymore, but with memory. Cold nights, empty pockets, crying babies, hunger, pain. "You once put us on the street like we were trash," she said, her voice calm. "And now you come back, like this?" David's lip trembled. "I'm not asking for anything. I wanted to see them. Just once. I've lost everything. I've been sleeping behind the bus depot. I'm not well. I'm sorry, Caroline. I don't expect forgiveness. I just didn't know where else to go." A long silence stretched between them. Caroline stepped outside, gently closing the door behind her so the kids wouldn't wake. "You look sick," she said, glancing at the snow building on his shoulders. "I am," he admitted. "The doctors say it's my liver. Too many years of drinking. I stopped. Too late, I guess." She stared at him. Part of her wanted to turn her back, walk away like he had once done to her. But something inside her, a deeper part, stirred. Not love, not sympathy, just humanity. "You need help," she said, "but you can't stay here." He nodded, ashamed. "I understand. I'll make a call," she said. "There's a shelter downtown that still has medical care. I'll pay for a cab to take you there, and I'll send some food with the driver. But after tonight, we don't have anything left between us, David. My children are safe now. That's my only job." He looked down. I know, and I'm glad you kept them safe, when I didn't. She nodded and turned back toward the door, pausing before she opened it. You may never get back what you lost, but I truly hope, you find some kind of peace before it's over. That was the last time she saw him. He died 2 months later at the shelter, quiet and alone. A man who had once had everything, his wife, his children, a home, and gave it all away for pride, for power, for nothing. Caroline never told the kids right away. When they were older, she would share the whole truth, carefully, honestly. But for now, she simply kept walking forward. Years passed. Michael graduated with honors. Ella became a teacher. Caroline sat in the front row at both their graduations, clapping with tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from joy. They had made it. They had not just survived the storm, they had built a life beyond it. And sometimes, when she passed by that old house, now owned by someone else, she would stop and smile. Not because of the memories, but because of how far she had come. That house had been a prison once, but it no longer held any power over her. She was free. She was whole. She was a mother who had chosen strength, and in doing so, had given her children the gift of hope. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Hope, where true resilience lives and real stories inspire. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and stay connected for more powerful stories like this one.